Hi, everyone. I'm Lana. Global greenhouse emissions are projected to drop by 8% this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. That's according to a new report by the International Energy Agency. But as a recent story in the New York Times explains, it's not all necessarily good news. As major economies scramble to reopen, emissions are likely going to soar again and possibly eclipse the world's previous rates of pollution. We are joined now by Sweta Chakraborty. She's a risk and behavioral scientist with the EcoHealth Alliance Leadership Council, and she joins us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Thank you. An 8% drop for 2020. Can you put this into perspective for us? And what's the likelihood that the rebound could potentially be worse for the environment?
Yes, absolutely. So despite the increasing global awareness that we need to really mitigate and adapt to climate change, we are still increasing every year in carbon emissions. So it wasn't a good story leading up to this year, 2020, when COVID-19 hit. Now we're going to see a decrease by the end of this year globally of 6%. For America, that's a 16-year low. That's good news, but that's a dent in the trajectory of the planet warming, which we are still on track for reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century. Remember, we're not meant to go past 1.5 degrees Celsius, period, by the end of the century. So the fact that we are still on this track towards reaching that means that this COVID-19 outbreak did nothing except make a dent in it. It's almost as if you just stop smoking a pack of cigarettes, even though you smoke cigarettes every single day, and hope that because of that, you're not going to get lung cancer. It's a similar analogy to the track we're on in terms of global warming. So we learned a lot from this in terms of what we can potentially do with energy consumption and what needs to happen to get carbon emissions reduced at a global scale. But that doesn't mean this in particular is going to get us off that trajectory.
Right. I know that the UN said that we would need to reduce our global emissions every year by 8% between now and 2030. And so it looks like on pace to do that for this year, but with a global pandemic and hopefully a situation that we are not going to repeat every year from here on out. The report from the International Energy Agency also noted that after past crises, that global emissions, according to the New York Times, have typically shot back up to previous levels once the initial shock passed. And we already know that China is getting back on board. They are the world's biggest consumer of coal energy. So what is the chance that as nations are now starting to try and come back online with economies that have really been damaged by the pandemic, that global emissions might actually increase? Is that a possibility?
That is historically what we've seen. So we know that there was a downtick in emissions following the 2008 financial crisis, but any reduction in emissions was offset by the increased carbon emissions the following year because all of the recovery and stimulus packages did not prioritize renewables. It still prioritized the cement industry and existing fossil fuel industries. And that's what's different. And that's the good news is now we are actually seeing renewable energies doing better than any other energy contributor, mainly because of how far we've come since 2008. It still doesn't have enough of a market share, and that's ultimately what the issue is going to be. But this is an opportunity to give that incentive to get renewable energies as part of that portfolio as we think about what governments can do to really include a more sustainable future as part of their long-term recovery plan. So incentivizing renewable sector, making sure that resilient infrastructure is in place, ensuring that there is efficiencies in there, that there are emphasis on battery and storage capacity for these types of renewables, including that as part of the recovery portfolio is really the unique difference that we have now in the time that's passed since the last disasters that we experienced globally.
So you say that it's an opportunity. Do you see actually any indication that governments are incentivizing green energy as part of their recovery plans and stimulus plans?
So we're seeing generally because renewables are doing better than any of the other sources of energy. The reason for that is because so many countries around the world have prioritized renewables going into the grid over other fossil fuels. That's something that the United States is really behind on. And there is a lot more increased awareness. We're seeing it well before COVID-19, the emphasis that was happening from top down, all of the initiatives taken at that governance level, global governance level from the UN, naming Nigel Topping from the UK a high-level climate champion champion, for example, to really lead the private sector voice in creating that collaboration that's really going to be necessary between the private and public sector to really get renewables becoming much more of the global energy market share. And so that is something that is happening at that top-down level. And then also bottom up, you're seeing climate activists all over the world that are really taking advantage of technology. Even in this time of shutdown, you're seeing that there's virtual activities that are going on. And so that real energy and emphasis is resulting in a push towards getting more countries to be held accountable for being better environmental stewards. It's those leaders like Brazil, like China, like the United States, that really need to pick up the slack. That's ultimately where we're not going to see a real change in global emissions until we get some of the worst offenders on board. That historically has always been the case, and that really needs to be what we consider now going forward. What is the role of America in all of this?
And we have heard that some cities like Los Angeles, Milan, elsewhere have actually seen, just in this short time period, a decrease in their smog and their pollution, an increase in the quality of their air. But as we mentioned, the UN says that emissions would have to fall by 8% every year until 2030 for the world to be able to contain climate change. Considering what we've seen in the last couple of months, with everything being shut down to make that happen, is this objective really feasible?
Well, what we don't want is to achieve this objective by going through the pains that COVID-19 caused for the economy and for those most vulnerable. That's not how we want to achieve this goal. But the opportunity that was shown through all of this is that human consumption can be reduced and we can prioritize renewables. The combination of both of that can really result in drastic carbon emission reduction in the coming years. Now, for us to have reached those really ambitious goals, we needed to have gotten on this bandwagon 20 years ago. So it's still extremely ambitious, and I think we need to shoot for it. The likelihood that we will be able to achieve that goal, given the trajectory that we're currently on, and despite COVID, is still very low, which is why we have to adapt to the various climate scenarios that are in our future. We know we're locked in to 1.5 degrees of warming no matter what. That's the best case scenario, right? Because that's already the amount of emissions that are in the atmosphere that are going to trickle down into that temperature rise. But that being said, that doesn't mean we need to get to 4 degrees warmer. We can still, based on collaborative action globally, make the lower emission scenarios the best case scenarios, and that will be the realistic outcome of what we're going to experience. That's going to require making some of the behaviors that have been positive from COVID-19, making them widespread and making them more permanent. Again, not smoking a pack of cigarettes is not going to stop you from getting lung cancer down the line. What can we learn from our behaviors? What can we actually put in place that isn't going to be painful for us, that's going to be an adjustment, but it's going to ensure that we don't have those worst case scenarios. It's going to stave those off, and it's going to make the 1.5 or something near it much more of a reality. That's ultimately what we can gain out of this COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, we sort of got a pass this year because of the most terrible of circumstances, but this provides us with a moment to try and think holistically about how we can help our economy as well as helping our environment. Sweta Chakraborty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.